To the deep dive. Today, we're not just analyzing a book. We are stepping onto a battlefield.
That's a good way to put it.
But it's not a battlefield of, soldiers and trenches and artillery. It's a battlefield of narratives, of history, and really the very definition of a civilization. It's a conflict over memory, over identity.
It really is. And the stakes here are incredibly high. The book we're looking at is titled 10 Heads of Ravana, a critique of Hindu-phobic scholars.
Right.
It's an anthology edited by Rajiv Malhotra and Divya Reddy, and it's produced by the Infinity Foundation India. And the central premise is, it's provocative, to say the least. It's designed to challenge the established order of how we understand India.
It uses a metaphor that I think anyone even remotely familiar with Indian mythology will instantly recognize, but it flips it. Right, it puts it into this modern academic context, the 10 Heads of Ravana. Now, in the popular imagination, Ravana is, the bad guy. He's the demon king who kidnapped Sita in the Ramayana. But in the actual tradition, he's much more complex than that, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely. That's the whole point. Ravana isn't just some brute. He is a Brahmin. He's a profound scholar. He knows the Vedas inside and out. He possesses immense power, siddhi, and a towering intellect.
Right.
But and this is the absolute crux of the metaphor for this whole deep dive, he uses that immense capability to disrupt the cosmic order. He uses it to violate Dharma. He uses his knowledge for his own ego, for domination, rather than for service or upholding the good.
And the book's argument is that today, right now, we're facing a very similar phenomenon. It posits that there are 10 specific heads. These are modern scholars, intellectuals, media figures who have that same kind of immense institutional power and knowledge. They are the gatekeepers.
Than the ones writing the test books.
Okay. Exactly. But instead of sustaining the civilization, the authors of this book argue that these figures are using their power to dismantle it from within, or at the very least to distort it until it's, completely unrecognizable.
That is the core thesis right there. And the heads we're going to be talking about, they aren't minor figures. These are the titans of Indology. These are the people whose books are required reading in universities from Delhi all the way to Harvard. They run the departments. They are the ones who define India for the rest of the world and, what's more, increasingly for Indians themselves.
Okay, so just to set the stage here, the mission for this deep dive is very specific. We are not here to attack these people personally. The source material is actually very clear about that. We are not interested in ad hominem attacks.
Right.
This is purely about the ideas.
Right. The book frames this entire project as an exercise in something called purva-paksha.
Purva-paksha, I love that term. But we really need to unpack it for a moment because it frames everything we're about to say.
It does. It's a traditional Indian method of dialectics or, formal debate. It effectively means that before you can even begin to refute an opponent, you have to fully understand their position.
So it's the opposite of a straw man argument.
The absolute opposite. You have to be able to state their case, their logic, their evidence, often better than they can state it themselves. You build up their case, that's the purva-paksha, and only then do you dismantle it with what you believe is superior evidence and logic. That's the uttara-paksha.
So the book isn't just, shouting slogans from the sidelines. It's making a concerted effort to say, look, here is what these scholars claim, here is why it's become the dominant view, and now here is the specific evidence that we argue proves them wrong.
Precisely. And they frame all of this as a civilizational battle. That's the term they use. The core conflict is this. Who gets to define India? Is India going to be defined forever through a Western lens, a colonial lens, maybe a Marxist lens? Or is there an indigenous, a dharmic perspective that has been systematically silenced and needs to be recovered?
Okay, that is the stage. We have a lot of ground to cover. For this deep dive, we're going to focus on 4 of the main heads detailed in the source material. We're going to look at Romila Thapar and the battleground of history.
A huge one.
Then we'll look at Sheldon Pollock and the battle for the Sanskrit language itself. After that, we'll tackle Michael Witzel and the very controversial origins of the Vedic people. And finally, we'll look at Devdutt Patnaik and the modern definition of mythology itself.
So it's a roadmap that covers history, language, archaeology, and philosophy. It's a huge undertaking.
It is. Let's dive into that first head, the historian, Romila Thapar. Now, if you have studied Indian history at any serious level, you know her name. She is preeminent. She is practically an institution unto herself.
Absolutely. A giant in the field.
But the source material, 10 Heads of Ravana, argues that her lens, her way of seeing history, is specifically Marxist. What does that mean for how she tells the story of India?
Well, a Marxist approach to history, in general, tends to view events primarily through the lens of class struggle and economic factors. That's the engine of history, right?
Right, material forces.
Exactly. It tends to downplay or even dismiss religious or cultural motivations in favor of material ones. So history becomes a series of transactions, of power struggles over resources. The critique in this book is that when Thapar applies this specific lens to Indian history, she actively and perhaps deliberately erases the religious trauma experienced by Hindus, especially during the medieval period. The source argues she sanitizes the violence.
And the book gives a really specific, really powerful example of this, the Somnath Temple. This is a huge, huge event in Indian history.
It is the classic case study. It's the one everyone goes to. For context, Mahmud of Ghazni, a Turkic ruler, raided the Somnath Temple in Gujarat back in 1025 CE. And this wasn't just some local shrine. It was a massive, incredibly wealthy temple complex.
Okay, so what is the narrative that Thapar presents according to the source?
Her narrative, as presented in the book, is that this raid was primarily motivated by economics.
The famous phrase, insatiable greed for gold.
That's the one. Her argument is that temples in India at that time were essentially banks. They held vast amounts of liquid wealth. Therefore, Mahmud attacked it to get the gold to fund his wars back in Central Asia. It wasn't really about hating Hindus or destroying idols. It was about cash flow.
And she also argues, I think, that the raid wasn't actually that traumatic for the local Hindus. That's a pretty big claim.
A huge claim. The book says she suggests it was largely forgotten and that, life just went on, business as usual.
But our source material says, hold on a second, just look at the primary sources.
Yes, and this is where that Purva Paksha method really kicks in. The authors point directly to Arab accounts from that period, specifically chroniclers like Ibn al-Athar. And these accounts, they don't just talk about gold.
What do they say?
They state explicitly that Mahmud's goal was to destroy the idol to prove the falsity of the Hindu gods. There's an account where he's offered an enormous amount of gold to leave the idol alone, and he specifically rejects it. He says he wants to be known in history as an idol breaker, not an idol seller.
Wow. I mean, you can't really spin that as just economics. That's a religious motivation, pure and simple.
It's as explicit as it gets. But the source goes further to rebut this idea that Hindus just forgot about it or didn't find it traumatic. They cite Jain texts from the same period. There's a text called the Satyapurya Sri Mahavira Utsaha from 1025 CE, the very year of the raid.
So an eyewitness account, essentially.
As close as you can get. And there's another one from the 14th century called Vividhatirtha Kalpa. And these texts, they don't sound like people who have moved on.
And what do they say? Do they sound like people who have forgotten?
Not at all. They explicitly lament the looting. They describe it as a disaster, a breaking of the cosmic order. The source argues this was not just a bad business day for them, it was a cultural and spiritual catastrophe. The critique is that Thapar ignores these indigenous voices, the voices of the victims, in order to maintain her theory that religious conflict wasn't a major driver of events.
There's also this piece of evidence that Thapar uses, right? An inscription about a land grant to an Arab trader, which she uses to prove that things were pretty much normal. This is her smoking gun for harmony.
Yes, she points to a land grant that was given to an Arab shipowner a bit later on to build a mosque. And she argues essentially, look, if they hated Muslims so much because of Somnath, why would they give land for a mosque right nearby?
Which on the surface sounds like a reasonable point.
It does, until you look at the context that the source provides. They argue that these Arab trade settlements had existed in Gujarat for a very long time, long before Mahmud's raid. Trade is trade. Giving a land grant to a specific trader you do business with doesn't erase the memory of a massive military raid and the destruction of your most sacred site.
It's a non sequitur.
The source argues it's exactly that. They say it's like arguing that because post-war Europe traded with Germany, the Second World War didn't happen or wasn't traumatic. A business transaction doesn't negate a historical trauma.
This theme of, let's call it whitewashing, seems to run through the entire section on Talar in the book. There's this broader idea that medieval Islamic rule in India was this great time of syncretism and harmony, and that any violence was just, politics.
That's the composite culture narrative. That's the term for it. Thapar and other historians of her school often argue that Muslim rulers were not religiously motivated persecutors and that, in fact, Hindu culture actually flourished because of this intermingling. They'll point to things like the Bhakti movement as prime evidence of this wonderful cultural synthesis.
But the source material pushes back on that. Hard.
Very hard. They argue that this narrative ignores the brutal realities on the ground, realities documented by the court historians of those same rulers. They list specific examples of destruction that were clearly religious in nature. Muhammad bin Tuluk destroying the Swayambhu Shiva temple, Firuz Shah Tuluk having a Brahmin burned alive for the crime of practicing his faith publicly. The source argues these aren't economic policies, they are acts of religious dominance.
So what about the Bhakti saints then? Because I've often heard that argument, that they represent this beautiful coming together of cultures.
The source material offers a fascinating counter-perspective on this. They argue that the great saints like Tulsidas, Mirabai, and Surdas wrote despite the rulers, not because of their patronage.
So in resistance to them.
In resistance, or at least in isolation from the court. They weren't sitting in Mughal courts holding hands and co-writing poetry. They were often working to preserve Dharma in what they saw as a time of crisis. The source frames them as cultural guardians, not products of a happy synthesis.
There's a detail in the book about Tansen, the famous musician. He is usually the poster boy for this Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, this composite culture.
Oh, absolutely. Tansen is always held up as the symbol of this synthesis, serving in Akbar's court. But the source notes that within the Orthodox Hindu tradition of the time, Tansen was initially considered a malecha, which means an outcast or a barbarian, precisely for serving Akbar.
So it wasn't seen as a glorious union by everyone.
Not by the practitioners at the time, the book argues. It was seen as a compromise. He had to essentially leave his Orthodox lineage to go serve the court. It complicates that simple, happy narrative of everyone just getting along.
It really changes how you view that period. Instead of a happy melting pot, the source paints a picture of a civilization struggling for survival.
And they add another layer with language. They quote Amir Khusrau, the famous poet. We usually think of him as this great bridge between cultures, but the source quotes him explicitly dismissing Indian languages as inferior in favor of Persian and Arabic. So the question the source asks is, where is the synthesis if the indigenous language is considered barbaric?
Speaking of indigenous texts, let's talk about the Ramayana. This is case study 3 in our roadmap for Thapar. She has a very specific take on the Ramayana that the book takes major issue with.
She does. Thapar suggests that the Ramayana, as we have it today, is a hegemonic text. She questions its historicity, of course, that's a given, but she also makes a very specific textual claim. She argues that the first book, the Balakanda, and the last book, the Uttarakanda, are later interpolations.
Interpolations, meaning they were added in later by someone else.
Exactly. She claims they were added by Brahmins much, much later for a specific purpose, to deify Rama, to turn him from a great human hero into a god, an avatar of Vishnu.
So her argument is that the real, original Ramayana is just the middle bit where he's a human king and all the god stuff was kind of pasted on later by a priestly class to assert their power.
Precisely. It fits perfectly with her theoretical framework that religion is a tool of power used by Brahmins to control the masses. But the source material fights this on two fronts. First, on the grounds of internal consistency. They argue that references to Rama as an avatar of Vishnu appear all throughout the middle books too, from the Ayodhya-kanda to the Yuddha-kanda.
So you can't just surgically remove the first and last books and strip away the divinity.
The book argues you can't. It's woven into the very fabric of the text from start to finish. Removing those two books doesn't actually change the fundamental nature of the story.
And what's the second front?
This one is really interesting. They bring in evidence from outside the Hindu tradition entirely. They cite the Buddhacharita by Ashvaghosha. This is a famous Buddhist text from the 1st century CE. And in that text, Ashvaghosha shows direct knowledge of the events described in these so-called interpolated books.
Wait, hold on. So if a Buddhist text from the 1st century CE knows about these books, they couldn't possibly have been added centuries later, as Thapar claims.
That is the argument the source makes. If the interpolation was already well known in the 1st century, then Thapar's timeline for this supposed Brahmanical conspiracy completely falls apart. It suggests the text was unified much, much earlier than she proposes. It suggests the divinity of Rama isn't some later invention, but is central to the story from the very beginning.
This all leads us to the final point on Thapar, which is about the very idea of the nation itself. I have heard this argument a lot in academia. India didn't exist before the British.
That is the standard academic line, more or less, that India, as we know it, is a modern nation-state construct, a product of the colonial experience. And before the British came and drew the lines on the map, it was just a chaotic collection of warring states with no real sense of unity. Thapar is a major champion of this view.
Her argument is that because there was no single king of India, there was no India.
Yes. And the Ten Heads of Ravana argues that this confuses the state with the nation. The state, the political machinery, the bureaucracy, that might be modern. But the nation, the cultural people, the civilization, that, they argue, is ancient. The source brings up the concept of Paratavarsha.
Right, for the Puranas.
They point directly to the Vishnu Purana, which gives a clear geographical description. The land north of the ocean and south of the Himalayas is the land of Arada. So the geographical concept was clearly there.
But a map isn't a nation.
True. But the book argues it wasn't just geographical, it was cultural. They talk about the Tirthas, the network of pilgrimage sites. You have Puri in the east, Dwarka in the west, Badrinath way up in the north, Rameshwaram at the southern tip. The argument is that these sites created a unified sacred geography, a shared cultural map.
So a pilgrim from, say, modern-day Kerala would see a site in the Himalayas as part of their sacred world.
Exactly. And you have to think about what that means. Without trains, without planes, people undertook these incredibly arduous journeys, walking for months or years, from the snowy Himalayas all the way to the tropical ocean at Rameshwaram. That implies a powerful sense of shared identity, a shared sacred landscape. The source argues that to deny this is a way of stripping the civilization of its antiquity and its cohesiveness. It's another way of saying you were nothing until the colonizers came and defined you.
All right, let's pivot to our second head. We're shifting from the battlefield of history to the battle for language itself. Sheldon Pollock. He is a giant in the world of Sanskrit studies, a very powerful Western Sanskritist.
A huge influence. If Thapar sort of owns history in the Western Academy, Pollock owns Sanskrit. And the critique of him in the book is very, very sharp. The source focuses on what they call his Hinduphobia and, very interestingly, his Islamophilia.
Let's start with his most famous, or maybe infamous, thesis, The Death of Sanskrit.
Yes. Pollock published a very famous paper with that title, The Death of Sanskrit. And he argued that Sanskrit is, for all intents and purposes, dead. Not just that people stopped speaking it as a mother tongue, but that its literary production, its creativity, ceased to be vital or innovative after about the 12th century.
And this is the key part. He links this death to the arrival of Islamic rule. But not in the way you might think.
Right. He doesn't say it was killed by invaders. He argues that it just lost its relevance. It died of natural causes. He compares it to the way Latin faded in Europe. He argues that as vibrant regional languages came up, Sanskrit just sort of faded away because the underlying culture lost its vitality.
But the source material just says, hold on, look at the numbers.
Right. They bring data to the fight. The source cites statistics showing a massive number of authors. I think the number they give is something like 6,970 producing original Sanskrit works between the 17th and 18th centuries.
That is way past the 12th century.
Yeah.
That's deep into the Mughal era and even post-Mughal.
Way, way past. They argue that Sanskrit continued to be used by kings, like in the powerful Vijayanagar Empire in the south, and by countless scholars all over the subcontinent. They argue that calling it dead is just absurd when thousands of people were still writing profound philosophy, poetry, and science in it. They say it would be like calling English dead in India today just because people also speak Hindi or Tamil.
And what about the cause of this supposed decline?
Right.
Pollock says it wasn't the invaders.
This is where the critique in the book gets really heated. Pollock, when describing the destruction of libraries, for instance in Kashmir, frames it using very passive language. The source quotes him describing it as, and I'm paraphrasing here, fires that periodically engulfed the capital. Things just burned.
As if it were an accident. Oops, the library caught fire again.
That is precisely the critique. The source argues this language deliberately obscures intentional acts of destruction. They mention Sultan Sikandar specifically, who was known not just as Butt-Shikan, or idol breaker, but also as a destroyer of books and libraries. The source's argument is that Pollock goes out of his way to absolve the invaders of any charge of cultural destruction, while simultaneously blaming the death of the language on the Hindu culture itself for supposedly losing its vitality.
Wow. Now, we have to touch on the most explosive claim in this section of the book, the so-called Nazi connection. This one really, really surprised me when I read it. Pollock tries to link Sanskrit to Nazism.
This is a very controversial part of Pollock's work, which the book dissects in detail. It comes from his paper on what he calls deep Orientalism. He writes about the deep structure of Sanskrit and attempts to draw a line connecting Indology and Sanskrit studies to the ideology that ultimately fueled the Holocaust.
How does he even make that connection?
He suggests there's a causal link between the hierarchical worldview he sees in some Sanskrit texts, like the Mimamsa school of interpretation, and the ideology of Nazism. It's a very complex argument, but that's the gist of it.
That seems like a massive, massive stretch. I mean, Hitler wasn't exactly known for being a fan of Indians or Hinduism.
That is exactly the rebuttal the book makes. The source notes that Hitler actually held Hinduism in deep contempt. He wasn't sitting around reading Mimamsa philosophy to plan the Holocaust. The authors of the source, specifically K.S. Cannon and Kunrad Elst in their chapter, they challenge Pollock directly. They say, find us a single Nazi quote that derives its inspiration for genocide from Hindu law. They argue it doesn't exist.
So why make that link in the first place? What's the purpose?
The source argues it's a very powerful rhetorical tactic to demonize the entire tradition. If you can subconsciously link Sanskrit to the Nazis in the minds of Western academics, you have effectively poisoned the well forever. Anything that comes out of that tradition, any philosophy, any text is now suspect, tainted by association.
The source also points out the hypocrisy of it all.
It does. It argues that if you really want to look for the intellectual roots of genocide, you don't need to go to Sanskrit grammar. You could look much closer to home at American history with the Native Americans and the doctrine of manifest destiny, or at European church history and its long, tragic relationship with anti-Semitism.
Speaking of grammar, that's the last point on Pollock that the book covers. He views Sanskrit grammar Vyakarana as primarily a tool of political power.
Yes, this is another core part of his thesis. Pollock argues that kings patronize the study of grammar to solidify their rule. It's all about power dynamics. He'll translate a word like Shastra as science of power or something similar.
And the source says,
they call this his miracles of metonymy. It's a clever phrase. They argue he is deliberately mistranslating words to fit his preconceived theory. For example, he'll translate the word Shastra solely as grammar or rule in contexts where it supports his theory, when the word simply means text or discipline or science. The source asserts that Indian intellectuals valued knowledge for its own sake or for spiritual goals like moksha, not just to help a king oppress his subjects. They feel Pollock politicizes everything, stripping the entire tradition of its spiritual core and turning ancient sages into mere political operatives.
It seems like a recurring theme we're seeing. Taking something spiritual or cultural and reducing it purely to power, politics, or economics.
That is the fundamental clash of worldviews at the heart of this book, the materialist lens versus what the authors would call the dharmic lens.
All right, let's move to our third head, Michael Witzel. He's at Harvard, the Wales professor of Sanskrit. And here we are entering the territory of origins, the Aryan invasion, or, as it's now called, migration theory.
And this is perhaps the single most heated, most contentious debate in all of Indian history. Witzel is a staunch, unapologetic defender of the Aryan migration theory, or AMT. His model is that a group of people he calls Aryans entered India from Central Asia around 1500 BCE.
The source material uses a very vivid image here that Witzel himself used, the tank metaphor.
Yes, Witzel has literally compared the Aryan chariots to tanks of the second millennium BC. He paints this picture of these pastoral tribes storming into India on horse-drawn chariots and terrorizing the local population. He even compares it to the Spanish conquistadors on horseback frightening the Aztecs.
Thundering chariots. It creates a very specific movie in your head, doesn't it? A movie of conquest, of invasion, of dominance.
It absolutely does. But the source material tries to dismantle this movie piece by piece, frame by frame. First, they go after it with archaeology. They start with the horse question.
Right. This is the classic argument.
Yeah.
There were no horses in the Indus Valley civilization, but the Vedic people in the Rig Veda loved their horses. Therefore, the Vedic people must have come from outside and brought the horses with them.
Exactly. That's the cornerstone of the theory. But the source counters this directly with findings from a site called Surkotada. This is a Harappan site excavated by J.P. Joshi, and there they found the remains of the true horse, Equus caballus.
And this isn't just a random claim from a nationalist archaeologist, right?
The source is very keen to emphasize that it's not. They state that the bones were examined and confirmed by a Hungarian expert named Sándor Bocconi, who was a world authority on ancient horse bones. And these remains were found in all phases of the settlement dating back to 2100 BCE. That date directly contradicts Witzel's 1500 BCE timeline for the arrival of the horse.
Okay, so that's the horse. What about the tanks, the chariots?
For that, the book points to the Sanoli excavations. This was a more recent dig. In 2018, archaeologists there found actual chariots, copper-reinforced, solid wheel chariots dating to around 2100-1900 BCE.
That is huge. That should change everything.
You'd think so. But the book says Witzel dismisses them. He calls them proto-chariots, or argues they must belong to some extra Harappan culture that doesn't count. The source argues he's just moving the goalposts to protect his long-held theory. If the horses and the chariots were already in India long before 1500 BCE, the whole invasion narrative loses its tanks.
The source also brings up a linguistic point, which I found fascinating. A specific mistranslation of a text, the Bakayana Shraddha Sutra.
Yes, this is a bit technical, but it's a crucial piece of the puzzle. There is a passage in this text about the movements of two ancient figures, Ayu and Amavasu. Witzel translated this passage in a way that suggests a migration into India. His translation has Ayu going east and Amavasu staying home, which he interprets as being in the west, outside India.
Which would support his theory of a migration coming in from the west.
Exactly. But the source cites other scholars, particularly Kunrad Elst, who argue that Witzel's translation gets the grammar wrong. They argue the text is actually describing a movement out of India. In their reading, the text says Ayu went east, towards the Ganga-Yamuna plain, and Amavasu went west, towards what is now Afghanistan. So instead of describing people coming in, the text could be describing an indigenous population expanding outward. The source flatly accuses Witzel of twisting the grammar to fit his migration model.
Before we leave Witzel, we have to talk about the California textbook controversy.
Yeah.
Because this wasn't just an academic spat, this was a real-world battle.
Yes, this is where the debate spilled out of the university and into the classroom. This happened when Hindu parent groups in California petitioned to correct what they saw as major errors in the 6th grade history textbooks. And Witzel led the academic charge against making these changes.
What kind of errors were they trying to correct?
All sorts of things. Simple factual errors, like the textbook claiming the Ramayana was written after the Mahabharata, but also more insidious things, like passages that implied because monkeys are characters in the Ramayana, that Hindus are somehow monkey worshippers or even related to monkeys. It was very messy. But the key conflict was about who gets to define Hinduism for American children.
There's a quote in the book from that controversy that really stood out to me. Witzel's group apparently said in a public statement, "Who in 6th grade cares which epic was written first?"
It's so dismissive, and the counter-response from the commissioner, Dr. Metzenberg, was perfect. She said, it obviously matters to Hindus. The source uses this exchange to highlight what they see as Witzel's attitude. He claims to be a world expert on the culture, yet he dismisses the genuine concerns of the people who actually live that culture as being irrelevant and childish.
It's that issue of authority again, isn't it? Who owns the narrative?
Yeah.
The tenured professor in Harvard or the community whose history it is.
That is the absolute heart of the civilizational battle that this book is trying to document.
Okay, we are down to our 4th and final head for this deep dive. Devdutt Pattanaik. Now, this one feels different. He's not a Harvard professor or a classical historian. He's more of a pop culture figure, a management guru, a mythologist for the masses.
And that, the book argues, makes him arguably even more influential than the others. He simplifies, or as the source would say, oversimplifies, these incredibly complex Hindu concepts for the corporate world, for television, for popular books. But the source accuses him of creating his own brand of interpretation, which they call devduttology, and they argue it's basically just making things up.
Let's start with his definition of Dharma. We touched on this in the intro. Pattanaik defines Dharma as potential.
Yes. His catchphrase is that Dharma is about fulfilling your potential. It's a thought, not an action.
The best of what one can do. It sounds very modern, very self-help, very palatable.
It does. It's very appealing. But the source argues it has absolutely no basis in any scripture. They point out that traditional texts, from the Mahabharata to the Dharma Shastras, consistently define Dharma as that which sustains society. It's about duty, righteousness, cosmic order. It's rooted in the Vedas, not in personal potential.
The source makes a really dark and provocative point about this potential definition, doesn't it?
They do. They take it to its logical conclusion. They argue that if Dharma is just fulfilling your potential, then a terrorist who is fulfilling their potential to cause terror could, by that definition, be considered dharmic. It completely strips the moral and ethical framework away from the concept. It makes Dharma dangerously subjective.
And what about the idea that it's thought, not action?
The source just refutes this by pointing to the Bhagavad Gita. The entire point of the Gita is Krishna explicitly exhorting a hesitant Arjuna to action, to fight, to do his duty. The source argues you cannot separate Dharma from right action. They say Pattanaik is turning a robust ethical system into a vague, toothless psychological concept.
This feeds directly into his bigger philosophy, which the book critiques heavily. His idea of myth, subjective truth.
Right. Your truth versus my truth. Patnaik loves to say that the West deals in objective truth, things like history and science, while India deals in subjective truth, which he calls myth.
It sounds very tolerant on the surface. Everyone has their own truth. Very postmodern.
But the source argues that it's a trap, a profound distortion. They argue that the entire Hindu tradition is obsessed with satya, with truth. The national motto of India is Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs, not my subjective truth triumphs. They argue the tradition is a search for a singular, supreme, objective reality, not a collection of personal feelings.
And by putting all of Indian history and scripture into the myth box,
you trivialize it, you dehistoricize it. The source argues this approach reduces epic figures like Rama and Sita to mere props in corporate management case studies. For example, Patnaik might say something like, Rama's excessive rule-following causes Sitas to suffer, to make a point about the dangers of corporate compliance. The book argues this reduces revered figures of righteousness to shallow cartoons for a PowerPoint presentation.
And the source claims he does all this while posing as an insider.
That is the real danger the book highlights. Because he has an Indian name, uses Indian terms, and looks like an insider, people both in India and abroad accept his distortions as authentic. The source contends that Patnaik poses as an insider, but uses Western colonial categories like mythology versus history to undermine the historical validity of Hindu texts, which are traditionally called itihasa, which means thus it was, or history. He is effectively telling Hindus that their history is just fantasy.
Wow. So when you step back and you look at all four of these heads we've discussed, Thapar, Pollock, Witzel, Patnaik, what is the big picture? What is the 10 Heads of Ravana really trying to say?
The synthesis, the overarching argument, is this. These scholars are not working in isolation. They form an ecosystem. It's not just a series of random disagreements. You have Thapar distorting the history to remove the dharmic element and sanitize the trauma. You have Pollock claiming the sacred language Sanskrit is dead and was politically oppressive. You have Witzel claiming the origins of the people are foreign, based on an invasion or migration. And then you have Patnaik trivializing the core philosophy into a subjective, feel-good myth.
It's like a pincer movement on the civilization from all sides.
Exactly. The source argues that these 10 heads and the ecosystem they represent systematically distort India's history, deny the antiquity and vitality of its sacred language, minimize the trauma of foreign invasions, and trivialize its most profound sacred concepts.
And that brings us right back to the mission of the book, which you mentioned at the start, the intellectual Kshatriya.
Yes. The book is dedicated to them. The purpose of this deep dive and of the source material itself is to equip the learner, and that's you, the listener, with the Purva-paksha, with the counter-arguments, so that you can begin to question these dominant academic narratives. To be an intellectual Kshatriya is to be a warrior on this battlefield of ideas.
And here is the final provocative thought that the source leaves us with. It's a question that really, really sticks with you after you put the book down.
It's a powerful one. If the history and the very definition of a civilization are written almost exclusively by those who view it through foreign lenses, be they Marxist, colonial, or postmodern, can the true potential of that civilization, to use Patnaik's word against him, ever be fully realized?
Or is the recovery of the indigenous narrative, as the book calls it, the first and most necessary step toward true independence, true self-knowledge?
That's the question they leave you with.
That is a powerful place to end. If this deep dive sparked your curiosity, we really encourage you to go to the source. Read the book, look up the verses they cite, check the archaeological data they reference. Don't take our word for it or theirs.
Exploration is always the key.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the 10 Heads of Ravana. We will see you in the next deep dive.